All right, so let's dive into Stoicism today. But not that whole like stiff upper lip thing you always hear about. I mean, today we're really going to explore it through the lens of Marcus Aurelius, you know, Roman emperor, but he almost seems more like a philosopher king. His personal journal meditations, it's amazing. It's just packed with insights on handling struggles that we all still deal with today, right? I mean, anxiety and anger and just feeling overwhelmed, even dealing with loss, it's all in there.
Yeah,
And what's crazy is this stuff is like over 2,000 years old,
right.
but it's still like shockingly relevant to us today.
And what makes Marcus Aurelius so interesting is that he wasn't, just some philosopher sitting around thinking all day. This was a guy leading an empire, plagues, wars, all of it. Imagine facing that kind of pressure and still taking the time to reflect and actually like put these Stoic principles into practice.
Yeah, that's incredible.
That's what's so fascinating, I think.
Exactly. And luckily, we have an excellent guide to help us with this. Donald Robertson's book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, he really breaks down how Stoicism, which actually started centuries before Marcus Aurelius, can be surprisingly practical, even in our crazy 21st century world. So, are you ready to embark on a little philosophical journey here?
I am.
Okay, good, me too. Let's start by getting to know Marcus Aurelius himself. I mean, he wasn't your typical emperor, was he?
Not at all. I mean, think about it. He inherited the most powerful position in the world, but his real passion was philosophy, not conquering new lands or having lavish parties.
Yeah, that makes sense when you think about meditations. It's not exactly a war diary, is it?
No, not at all. And yet his reign was anything but peaceful. The Antonine Plague, which historians think might have been smallpox, swept through the Roman Empire during his time. He also dealt with constant wars on the borders, especially up north.
Oh, wow.
And then on top of that, he faced betrayals from people he thought he could trust.
Wow. Talk about putting your philosophy to the test, right? So how did Stoicism help him deal with all of that?
Well, Stoicism basically gave him a framework for getting through those challenges. One of the core principles is that virtue is the only true good. Everything else, wealth, health, even your reputation, all of that's considered indifferent. Stoics focused on what they could control, which was mainly their own thoughts and actions, and they accepted what they couldn't control.
Okay, so even with something as terrifying as a plague, Stoicism encouraged him to focus on his response, not the event itself.
Exactly. It's not about suppressing emotions, but about choosing a wise response, using reason to guide you. And remember, the goal wasn't to be emotionless,
Right.
Stoic in that stereotypical way. It was to develop a calm and clear mind, even when everything around you is chaotic.
That makes sense.
Which brings us to the origins of Stoicism. I mean, it wasn't something Marcus Aurelius just came up with, right?
No, I was just going to ask about that. It goes back way before him, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It goes all the way back to Zeno of Citium. He was a merchant until, get this, he was shipwrecked and lost everything. And that led him to philosophy. That's how Stoicism was born.
Wow, that's incredible.
A shipwreck leading to one of the most enduring philosophies in history.
Yeah, it's almost poetic.
Yeah.
Like you lose everything material, and then what's left? Just your thoughts and choices. It's like a perfect intro to Stoicism. But I have to admit, the word Stoicism doesn't exactly have the best reputation these days. A lot of people think it means being cold and emotionless. Is that really what it's about?
Not at all. That's one of the biggest misconceptions about Stoicism. It's not about denying your emotions. It's about understanding and managing them. Stoics believed you could feel emotions fully, but not be controlled by them. And that's where those Stoic techniques come in.
Oh, good. So how do they actually do that? I'm guessing the book gives some specific examples from Marcus Aurelius's life.
It does. And Robertson connects them to modern practices like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT,
Yeah.
which is pretty cool.
Oh, interesting.
Like there's this technique called cognitive distancing. It's all about taking a step back from a situation and describing it objectively, without all the emotional baggage.
So instead of saying, my boss is a total jerk, you'd say, my boss did this specific thing.
Exactly. You're separating the facts from your emotional interpretation of the facts. Robertson actually gives a great example from Meditations. Marcus Aurelius talks about watching gladiatorial combat, and he realized those gladiators clinging desperately to life, they were like a mirror to our own human tendency to cling to desires that ultimately cause us suffering.
It's an interesting analogy. Speaking of clinging to desires, what about that technique, negative visualization? I got to admit, the name sounds a little counterintuitive. It's like purposefully imagining bad things happening.
Yeah, in a way, but it's not about being pessimistic. Think of it like this. If you mentally prepare for setbacks, it can help you appreciate what you already have, Plus, when those real challenges do pop up, they're less likely to totally throw you off balance. He uses that classic fable of the town mouse and the country mouse to really illustrate this. Remember that one?
Oh, yeah. The town mouse has all this fancy food and a nice comfy house,
Yeah.
but he's all stressed out, like always on edge. And the country mouse is living simply, but he just seems content, you know?
Exactly. And Marcus Aurelius, he used this fable to remind himself, and really to remind all of us, that we often crave what we don't have. Instead of appreciating what's right there in front of us, it's like a practice in gratitude and like resetting your expectations, which can be so helpful if you're feeling anxious or overwhelmed.
I can see how that would be helpful. But doesn't that kind of go against the whole idea of striving for excellence?
Yeah.
Which I always thought was like a big part of Stoicism.
That's a great question, and it really highlights how important it is to find that balance. Stoicism encourages us to strive for what we can control, like our own virtue and our actions. But at the same time, accepting that the outcome isn't always up to us. It's about putting in the effort, but not getting too attached to the results.
Okay.
Which actually leads to another Stoic technique, premeditation of adversity.
Okay,
It's basically like running mental fire drills for those challenging situations, you
Yeah.
know. You imagine those potential obstacles and setbacks ahead of time. And that way you can rehearse how you're going to respond, and you build up your resilience.
So instead of getting blindsided by a problem, you've already thought about how you might handle it. I like that. I
Exactly.
can see how that would help reduce anxiety.
Yeah.
Does Robertson give any examples of Marcus Aurelius actually using this technique?
He does. There's this great anecdote in the book where Marcus uses that fable of the boar and the fox. The boar sharpens his tusks even when there's no immediate danger. He knows that when a threat does appear, it'll be way too late to prepare.
Oh, right. So it's all about being mentally prepared.
Yeah.
Whatever life throws your way. Just like that time when Marcus faced the Sarmatian cavalry charge. Oh, man, I can only imagine how scary that must have been.
Absolutely. But because he had mentally prepared for those kinds of situations, he and his legions were able to face that threat with so much more courage and composure. And this actually connects with one of the most fundamental Stoic principles, the dichotomy of control.
Okay, this one sounds important.
It's pretty simple, really. Focus your energy on what you can control, your thoughts, your actions, your reactions, and accept what you can't control, like the weather, other people's opinions, the economy, stuff like that.
But wouldn't that lead to just being passive? If you just accept everything that happens, doesn't that discourage you from taking action to try and improve your situation?
Well, that's a common misconception. The dichotomy of control isn't about being passive at all. It's about choosing your battles wisely
Yeah.
and putting your energy where it really makes a difference. You can influence your own choices and responses, but you can't control the whole external world, right? It's about letting go of that need to control everything and finding that peace even when things are uncertain.
That makes sense. It's like realizing the difference between what you can actually influence
Yeah.
and what you're just like needlessly worrying about.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we're focusing on our own little sphere of control, does that mean we should just ignore what other people are doing, even if they're like doing something that harms us?
Not necessarily. And this is where another powerful Stoic principle comes in, viewing others as our kinsmen.
So even someone like Avidius Cassius, for those who don't know, he was a Roman general who actually led a rebellion against Marcus Aurelius. That's a pretty big betrayal.
It was a huge challenge, for sure. But even in that situation, Stoicism encouraged Marcus Aurelius to try and understand and to cultivate empathy.
But why? I mean, how can you empathize with someone who's actively trying to overthrow you?
Well, Stoics believed that everyone, even those who seem to be acting unjustly, are ultimately driven by their own beliefs and struggles. It's not about condoning bad behavior, but about recognizing our shared humanity, It allows you to approach conflict with a bit more understanding and maybe even some compassion.
Okay, that's a pretty radical idea, especially when you're dealing with someone like Avidius Cassius. So did Marcus Aurelius actually forgive Cassius for that rebellion?
He actually chose clemency over punishment, but unfortunately, Cassius was assassinated by his own troops before Marcus could actually formally pardon him.
Wow, that's a whole other story. But it does show how Marcus Aurelius really lived by these principles. It wasn't just theoretical for him. And speaking of living these principles, the book goes into some detail about Marcus's personal struggles, too. I mean, he wasn't immune to pain and suffering, was he?
Not at all. In Meditations, we see him struggling with chronic pain and illness. Robertson even mentions that Marcus had some health issues from a young age.
Really? It's hard to imagine. Here's this powerful emperor, and he's dealing with physical limitations and pain, just like anyone else. So how did Stoicism help him in those moments?
It allowed him to change how he thought about pain and to focus on what he could control, which was his mental and emotional response. It's not about pretending the pain wasn't there, but about choosing how you relate to it.
I can imagine that's a tough skill to learn. Was there anything in particular that helped him?
Robertson highlights a quote from the philosopher Epicurus that really resonated with Marcus. Pain is either intense but short-lived, or chronic but endurable. It's a reminder that even the most intense suffering is temporary, and even chronic pain can be managed.
So it's about finding ways to cope and knowing that it won't last forever. That seems like it could apply to so much more than just physical pain. It's like a mindset for dealing with any kind of hardship. And it feels especially relevant when we think about loss, which is something Marcus Aurelius also experienced so deeply.
Yes, absolutely. He lost several children during his lifetime, as well as close friends and advisors. And in meditations, we see him thinking about these losses with incredible honesty and vulnerability.
Yeah, he writes so beautifully about burying his loved ones and recognizing that death is a natural part of life. It's not about being cold or detached. It's about finding a way to process that grief without being completely consumed by it.
Yes, and for Marcus Aurelius, that acceptance, not resignation, but acceptance, was a key part of his Stoic practice. And it's important to remember the context here, too. I mean, he was emperor during all of this. Facing this immense pressure and responsibility, it's incredibly challenging to maintain your virtue in that kind of position.
Yeah, that's for sure. And when you compare Marcus to his co-emperor, Lucius Verus, the contrast is pretty striking. Lucius seems like he just indulged in all the trappings of power, the luxury, the parties, and he didn't seem to take his responsibilities as seriously.
Yeah, it does seem that Lucius had a different approach to leadership, one that wasn't so aligned with Stoic principles.
But some people might say that Lucius was just enjoying the perks of his position. Was he really being unvirtuous in the eyes of the Stoics?
That's a good question. While Stoicism doesn't say that wealth or pleasure are bad, it does emphasize that virtue is the only true good. From a Stoic perspective, Lucius focusing on external pleasures might be seen as a distraction, from the pursuit of wisdom and moral excellence.
So it wasn't necessarily that he was having a good time, but that he was focused on the wrong things. But for Marcus, Stoicism wasn't just a personal philosophy. It really shaped his leadership style, too.
Absolutely. It influenced how he made decisions, how he handled conflicts, even how he saw his role as emperor. It's what makes his story so fascinating. He wasn't just writing about Stoicism, he was living it in this very public and challenging role. And this brings up an important point that Robertson emphasizes, the role of mentors in developing a Stoic practice. Marcus Aurelius was lucky to have some incredible mentors in his life.
Yes, like his adoptive father, Antoninus Pius. He was known for being a just and wise leader.
Exactly. Antoninus Pius was a role model for Marcus. He showed what virtuous leadership could look like in the real world. And then there was Junius Rusticus, Marcus's Stoic tutor.
I was just going to ask about him. Robertson seems to think that Rusticus was a huge influence on Marcus's philosophical development.
He was. Rusticus encouraged Marcus to go beyond just studying Stoicism and to really embody it in his daily life.
So putting those principles into action. Which brings us to this idea Robertson mentions called the Stoic Reserve Clause. This one sounds kind of mysterious.
Yeah.
Can you explain what it's all about?
Sure. The Stoic Reserve Clause is about going through life with this fate-permitting kind of mindset. It means recognizing that we can set goals and we can strive for what we want, but ultimately some things are just out of our control.
So it's about not getting too attached to outcomes.
Exactly. You put in the effort, you do your best, but you accept that the results aren't always guaranteed. And this goes back to that dichotomy of control we were talking about earlier. You focus on what you can influence, like your actions, your efforts, and you let go of the rest.
I can see how that would be so valuable for someone like Marcus Aurelius. I mean, he was constantly dealing with uncertainty, like military campaigns, political intrigue, natural disasters.
Absolutely. The reserve clause gave him a way to deal with those challenges. Without getting totally overwhelmed by anxiety or frustration, it helped him stay calm and clear-headed, even in the middle of chaos.
Okay, so let's bring this back to our own lives now. Do we need to find our own Junius Rusticus to guide us on this Stoic path? Is it essential to have a personal mentor to apply these principles?
Having mentors and role models is definitely helpful. They can give you guidance and support, and they can inspire you. But even if we don't have a modern-day Rusticus in our lives, we can still cultivate that inner mentor by studying the lives and teachings of Stoic philosophers like Marcus Aurelius.
So reading books like How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, reflecting on those Stoic principles,
Mhm.
and then, most importantly, putting them into practice.
Exactly. And that means regularly using those techniques we talked about. Cognitive distancing, negative visualization, premeditation of adversity. It's about building those mental habits, just like you would build physical fitness.
So the more we practice,
Hmm.
the more those Stoic principles become a part of our everyday lives. It's not just about reading about philosophy, it's about actually doing philosophy, making it a way of life, as Robertson says.
Precisely. And that's what makes Stoicism so relevant today. Because even though the specific challenges we face might be different from the challenges people faced in ancient Rome, they're still fundamentally human challenges.
Right. We might not be facing barbarian hordes, but we have our own versions of plagues, wars, and betrayals.
We do. Think about the stress, the burnout, the anxiety we face today. Those are very real struggles in the 21st century.
Yeah, for sure.
And Stoicism gives us a way to build resilience, to find peace and clarity in the midst of all that.
It's not about pretending that life is easy or suppressing our emotions. It's about choosing how we respond, what we focus on,
Mhm.
and remembering that virtue is the ultimate goal. And that's what's so cool about Stoicism, right? You don't have to become a hermit or live in a cave
Mm,
to actually benefit from it.
that's true. You can just take the pieces of wisdom that resonate with you and
Yeah.
apply them in a way that makes sense for your own life. It's really adaptable
No.
and practical.
This is making me think about something you said earlier, about choosing a wise response instead of just letting our emotions run wild. That really sticks with me. I catch myself getting so caught up in stuff I can't control, the news cycle or other people's drama. It's exhausting.
It is. We live in a world that's constantly throwing information and stimulation at us. And that's where that stoic practice of focusing on your own sphere of influence can be so helpful.
Yeah, it's not about being passive or ignoring what's happening, but just choosing where we put our energy and attention.
Exactly. And remembering that we can't control those external events, but we can control how we respond to them.
There's another thing that's been on my mind since we started talking about all this idea of viewing others as our kinsmen,
Mm.
even when they're driving us nuts.
It's a big shift in perspective, isn't it?
It really is. Because
Yeah.
it makes you remember that everyone is fighting their own battles, dealing with their own stuff.
Yeah, everyone's got their own insecurities and struggles. It doesn't excuse bad behavior, but it can help you deal with conflict with a little more understanding and maybe even a bit more compassion.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Stoicism and Marcus Aurelius, what's the one thing we hope our listeners take away from all this?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that this ancient philosophy, it's surprisingly relevant to our lives today. We may not be facing barbarian hordes, but we have our own modern-day plagues and wars and betrayals.
Right, stress, burnout, anxiety. Those are some pretty big challenges.
They are. And Stoicism gives us this framework for building resilience, for finding peace and clarity in the middle of all that chaos.
It's not about pretending that life is easy or suppressing our emotions. It's about choosing those wise responses, focusing on what we can control, and remembering that virtue is the ultimate goal.
Exactly. And like Marcus Aurelius showed us, it's not just a philosophy you read about, it's a philosophy you live. It's about practicing these techniques every single day, building those mental habits that help us face life's challenges with more grace and wisdom.
So here's a final thought for everyone listening. What if you tried incorporating just one Stoic technique into your life today? Cognitive distancing, negative visualization, the reserve clause. Just pick one and see how it changes things for you.
You might be amazed by how much this ancient wisdom can offer us, even in these modern times. And if you want to learn more, pick up a copy of How to Think Like a Roman Emperor.
It's a fascinating and surprisingly practical look at Stoicism, both as a philosophy and a way of life. Until next time, keep diving deep